Hello, this is Alan Blumkin. I'm with David Nemec, and we are doing the old-time baseball history and trivia show. We've been off the last 2 weeks for the holidays, and we're continuing to do histories of the 16 teams that comprise the major leagues before the first expansion in 1961. Today we're going to discuss the Philadelphia Phillies, who have a long and very, very varied history. Welcome, David.
Welcome to you, Al. Happy New Year.
The same to you.
Thank you.
And the Phillies have been around since 1883, and they've had a lot of ups and downs, mostly downs. And I'm going to ask David to discuss the Phillies in the 19th century.
Well, the 1882 season was a pivotal one in the major leagues. The American Association launched itself as a rival to the National League and immediately established that it would be a formidable one. It put a team in Philadelphia, which had been abandoned by the National League in 1876 when the Philadelphia National League Club refused to take its last Western road trip. The same is true of New York. So there were no National League teams in New York or Philadelphia at that time, the two largest cities. And that held true through the 1882 season. In 1883, when the National League got wind of that the American Association also intended to establish a team in New York, when they got the independent New York Mets to join the American Association, the league, upon the death of its titular head, William Hulbert, who had been very adamant about allowing New York and Philadelphia back into the National League, opposed to it throughout his tenure. The National League quickly dropped its two dregs. Teams in, of all places, Troy, New York, and Worcester, Massachusetts. Hard as it is to believe now, those two teams were fairly long-standing National League teams at that time. They'd been in the National League for several years. They were drawing in double digits. There are reports that the Worcester team even drew in single digits on occasion. In any case, they were dropped. The New York entry with National League entry, which was a prize one in the National League, had a pipeline to the Troy team and immediately corralled all of Troy's talent, which included future Hall of Famers Buck Ewing, Mickey Welch, Roger Connor, and the formidable pitcher Tim Keefe. Philadelphia had no such pipeline to the Worcester team. In fact, it lost. The Worcester team, its top player at the time, Harry Stovey, immediately jumped to the American Association Philadelphia team. And so the Philadelphia team really was in dire straits when it got off the ground. It did get as its captain and player manager Bob Ferguson, who had been a member of major league teams since 1871, the first year of what many of us consider Major League Baseball, the National Association. And at that point, he was now in his middle 30s. Ferguson had been a long-established third baseman. He'd also shown himself to be a good umpire. What he was not, however, was a good field manager. Most of his players disliked him. The Philadelphia team got off to a terrible start and soon sank into last place. And its number one pitcher, rookie named John Coleman, incredibly enough, won 3/4 of the team's games, 12, a total of 12. The team only won 16 games, but he lost 48, a staggering figure. It's unimaginable today that a pitcher could lose 48 games in a season, especially in a season when his team only played 99 games. The schedule then called for a mere 100, and Philadelphia fell one short. So they were a terrible seller team, and not much was looked for them for the future until they hired Harry Wright, at that time considered the finest manager in Major League Baseball. Wright had gone all the way back to the Cincinnati Red Stockings in the late 1860s when they'd gone undefeated for the entire year in 1869. He had then managed Boston for since 1871 through 1882, and now was a free man, and Philadelphia grabbed him, was ecstatic to get him, and justifiably so, because Wright immediately corralled enough talent so in 1883 the Philadelphia team, while not a contender by any means, was a fairly decent National League entry. And the prize that Wright corralled was a pitcher named Charlie Ferguson, who proved to be one of the finest Major League talents in the 1880s until after the 1887 season, when he tragically met an early death from, lung disease, tuberculosis, and but two other players that Wright brought on the team that year, much less touted than Ferguson, were a first baseman named Sid Farrar, who had no previous baseball history of any substance, and a third baseman who they'd gotten actually when he was released by Providence, named Joe Mulvey. These two men would stay with Wright all the way through the 1880s. And if you look at the career record of Sid Farrar, it's unimaginable that this man could have been a Major League first baseman for actually 7 full seasons. No, 7 full seasons. And 8 full seasons, because he had been with the team in 1883. And Farrar actually is more well known as the father of Geraldine Farrar, the great opera star. But Farrar and Mulvey were exactly the kind of players that Wright looked for. They could play, Farrar could not, but Mulvey could play a number of different positions. They were team players. They were good base runners. They were smart. They always kept their heads in the game. And that was what Wright looked for first and foremost. Particularly, he looked for versatile players. And he managed to get quite a number of them. And if you look at their career stats, some of them you can, it's almost unbelievable that they were actually Major League players in some cases for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Two in particular were Charlie Bassett and Charlie Bastian, who were middle infielders and very, very important men in Wright's team composition. Neither of them could hit at all, but both were good fielders, good team players, and excellent men, and they could play almost any infield position well. And he built this team around little ball, what we call today little ball. At that time, it was called Wright ball, because it had been the kind of team he first formulated with the Cincinnati Red Stockings in the 1860s, and he continued with this kind of team throughout the 1880s. It was built on good defense, good base running, and good pitching. Ferguson was the fulcrum for the pitching staff in the early years. By 1887, however, when the rules changed and a pitcher had to keep 1 foot anchored when he delivered the ball, it took away Ferguson's pitching style, forced him to change. And Ferguson was actually in the process of converting to a second baseman in the 1887 season, and a good one, when he tragically died during the winter between 87 and 88. Wright, meanwhile, was building teams that were always in at least moderate contention. but never good enough to really go over the top. And the reason, quite simply, was he never had a really formidable hitter in the middle of his lineup. Nobody who could drive in runs. Nobody he could count on to deliver a key hit, particularly an extra base hit. His teams really were very, very, very weak hitting teams. They were hitting the 220s, and they still, nevertheless, would finish above 500, second or sometimes third place, usually, fourth. Then in 1890, the Players League came along, and the Players League siphoned quite a number of rights players away from him and forced him to take on some new players. One new player he had acquired when the Detroit franchise dissolved was probably the greatest power hitter of the late 1880s, Sam Thompson, who had a strong left-handed bat, hit for power, had pretty good speed, was a pretty good outfielder. Thompson for Detroit had put up very imposing numbers year after year. When he came to Philadelphia, however, and he was forced to play Wright's brand of ball, his hitting figures dropped precipitously. And that continued actually into the 1890s, early 1890s. And in 1888, Wright acquired another, even more formidable hitter, although at that time he was a second baseman, named Ed Delahanty. And Delahanty was brought to the Philadelphia Phillies and to play second base, and was forced pretty much to blend in with Wright's brand of ball. And for the first 3 years of his career in particular, Delahanty wasn't much of a hitter. And it wasn't until he went to the Players League and was exposed to a few other players from other teams, that Delahanty began to hit a little bit more. And in the early and then after the Players League was dissolved, Wright acquired another tremendous player named Billy Hamilton. Hamilton came over from the Kansas City team, which was an American Association entry and had folded, and he was sold to Philadelphia. So Wright entered the 1890s with an outfield of Sam Thompson, Ed Delahanty, and Billy Hamilton. And he had also a pretty strong hitting core all the way through his lineup, including catcher Jack Clements, the best.
When did Joey get there?
Pardon me?
When did Joey get there?
Lajoie didn't get there till much later in the 90s.
Okay.
But Clements had come to the team actually in 1885 after the Union Association dissolved. And Clements was a left-handed catcher, and by 1890s, once Wright had lightened up on the pedal a little bit and allowed these guys to start swinging away, became a tremendous power hitter as well. Set records for the most home runs by a catcher, along with hitting for a very solid average. He still holds the record for the highest batting average in a season by a catcher qualifier. I believe it's 394. And Clements, Hamilton, Thompson, and Delahanty formed the middle of the Phillies lineup, and it was probably the strongest middle of the lineup. It arguably was. There might not have been a better one in Major League history, but these guys all hit, and they hit a ton. And when the pitching distance changed in 1893, and hitting became even more prominent, the Phillies in 1894 rattled off an incredible team batting average in the 340s, mostly led by these four guys, and including a fourth outfielder who couldn't get playing time because he had a deal with Hamilton, Delahanty, and Thompson. Tuck Turner, who also hit 400 that year, and yet the Phillies finished pretty far off the pace. The reason for that seemingly is that they just didn't have enough pitching. But there's also another factor that contributed heavily to their failure to put together a really strong contending team, and that was the beating in 1894 of shortstop Bob Ellen, who had become more or less Wright's field captain and manager. He handled the men on the field. He took care of things. And when he went down, when he was beamed, the Philadelphia team no longer played up to its potential. They finished a pretty distant, pretty far behind the top teams, Boston and New York, and the pennant-winning Baltimore Orioles in 1894. And really, the Phillies, with just a little more pitching, and perhaps if Ellen had stayed healthy for the full season, might have even won their first pennant. They were that strong. After the 1894 season, they started making trades. Thompson was near the tail end of his career. Hamilton was traded to Boston for third baseman Billy Nash, who became the Phillies player manager. The team started to fade. But then toward the end of the 1890s, they came on strong again when they picked up Nat Lajoie, a rookie from the minor leagues. They picked up another rookie outfielder named Elmer Flick. They picked up two good, solid pitchers who would prove to be very strong in the early part of the 20th century, Al Orth and Bill Bernard. These were the guys that they entered the 20th century with. And in 1900, the Phillies were a very, very strong team and seemed to be building a contender for years to come.
And then the American League came in, and with the Phillies owner,
and Al can discuss exactly what happened.
The Phillies owner, John Rogers, was known to be very, very cheap, and he was one of the architects of the policy to deflate salaries as much as possible. So when the American League came in, the American League put in the Philadelphia Athletics, headed by Connie Mack, and the Phillies were one of the teams that suffered the most by players jumping from the National League to the American League. Lajoie and Bernard jumped to the Philadelphia A's, and after 1 year there, they were prohibited from playing with the A's by a court order, which set in Pennsylvania that said they belonged to the Phillies. So Lajoie was sent to the Indians, and he could never play for a number of years. He could never play against the A's in Philadelphia.
Bernard came with him, and so did Elmer Flick.
Oh, Elmer Flick wound up on the Indians, in Cleveland, and there was a suggestion a couple of years later that Flick would be traded to the Tigers, even up for Ty Cobb. That, of course, didn't materialize. And Ed Delahanty went to Washington. He jumped to the Washington Senators, and he didn't like it there, and was preparing to jump back to the National League, I think to the Giants, in 1903, when he got drunk on a train over Niagara Falls, got into a fight with a conductor and wound up either being shoved or jumping off the bridge. And this is July 2nd, 1903, and there's a book by Mike Sowell on this whole incident that is very, very good, and has all the details of the whole Delahanty situation. He was killed in the bridge jump, and that was the end. And the Phillies were not one of the National League contenders until the next decade, when in 1911 they picked up a rookie by the name of Grover Cleveland Alexander. By this time, the Phillies were playing in Baker Bowl, which is a ballpark that is now not
built
in
the 1890s. It was at the time it was erected. It was the old park burned down, And at the time it was erected, it was a state-of-the-art park. And the Phillies, as a result of their park and having good, strong hitting teams, they were the leaders in attendance in the 1890s among all the National League teams. And that park, as we'll find out as we go along in our discussion, became an albatross rather than an attribute.
Well, they started to rise in the early teens, and they were also significantly hurt by the emergence of the Federal League for 2 years, when several of their players, particularly the middle infielders, jumped to Federal League teams. But in 1915, sparked offensively by outfielder Gabby Cravath, and the incredible pitching of Grover Cleveland Alexander, they won their first pennant. They won the first game of the World Series in 1915, and they were swept in 4 by the Red Sox. And then after 1917, now anybody who listens to this should just look up what Grover Cleveland Alexander did from 1911 to 1917, pitching in that ballpark. In 1916, he pitched 16 shutouts, which is a record that, especially the way pitchers are now used nowadays, will never be broken. And they sold Alexander and his Bowery mate Bill Killefer to the Chicago Cubs before the 1918 season, and then went into a downhill spiral basically for the next 30 years. The only winning season they had between 1917 and 1948 was finishing 2 games over 500 in 1932. And as David mentioned earlier, the Baker Bowl became a albatross, and they had a tin wall out in right field, which was 250 feet away, and hitters, especially Chuck Klein, who was in the Hall of Fame, who won the Triple Crown playing for them in 1933. This was somewhat a combination of Fenway Park and Coors Field for hitters. In 1930, they hit 315 as a team. They also won 52 games and lost 102.
Their pitching staff was
terrible.
It had some of the worst pitchers ever.
A ERA staff record of 671, which is still the record for the worst by a pitching staff since 1901. And they had one of their pitchers was Les Sweetland, who pitched 154 innings and had an ERA of 7.71, which is still the record for highest ERA by any pitcher who's pitched that many innings.
Yeah, they had another pitcher, Claude Willoughby, was right behind him. Yeah.
And there's an old joke there that went, my country 'tis of thee, Sweetland and Willoughby, is a parody. And once one of their managers went up during that season and presented his lineup to the umpires, and he put down for pitcher Willoughby and others. And they really they unloaded Chuck Klein after the 1933 season, and by that time I think they were being run by a man named Jerry Nugent, who had trouble
what
making.
What happened was, Baker had died, and when he left the club to his secretary, and Nugent, who'd been a minor official with the club, married the secretary, and at that point inherited, became co-inheritor of the team. And he didn't really have any money of his own, and they were really financially strapped throughout the 30s. And anybody, like Klein, anybody of any talent immediately became a target for other National League teams.
Yeah, in 1938, they finally gave up the Baker Bowl and became tenants of the Athletics, and what was then known as Shibe Park, which most people know as Connie Mack Stadium. And as David pointed out, just as soon as they developed a ball player, it turned out to be halfway decent. And examples of this are Bucky Walters, Dolph Camilli, Claude Passo, became viable. They would sell them elsewhere. Walters went to the Reds. Paso went to the Cubs, and Camilli went to the Dodgers. They weren't the only three, but they were probably the three most well-known. And the Phillies were a basket case. So from 1938 through 1942, they never won over 50 games in the season, and they won that many once. So it was a record like 49-105 was standard for that 5-year period, and combined with the Athletics, who were in a similar position in the American League, poor Philadelphia fans had more bad baseball than you could possibly imagine. And then they got an owner named William Cox, who bought out Nugent. And Cox, no relation to the Dodger third baseman of that same name, was brought in before Judge Landis, and Landis had him thrown out of baseball for gambling on his own team. Why anybody in those days would bet the Phillies has been beyond most people's comprehension. But he sold it to Robert Carpenter. And finally, they brought in Herb Pennock to be the general manager, and they finally decided to develop a farm system. And by 1948, most of the pieces were in place. Robin Roberts and Kurt Simmons were there as bonus babies for the pitching staff. They brought in Richie Ashburn, Granny Hamner, and
Ashburn was a rookie.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and Willie Quinton Jones. And they also had from 2 years before, in 1946, Del Ennis. And to me, Ennis was a very, very good player. And outside the year of 1951, when he had severe back problems, he was good for 100 RBIs a year. So finally, they made a quantum leap in 1949. Then in 1950, they became known as the Whiz Kids, because almost everybody was under 30, and they won the National League pennant. The last day of the season, they beat the Dodgers.
Yeah,
and they were swept by the Yankees in the World Series. What happened there was that Kurt Simmons, who was 17-8, was called up by his National Guard unit in early September, when the Guard unit was activated to participate in the Korean War. And when Simmons left, and another starter, Bubba Church, was hit in the eye with a line drive off the bat of Ted Kluszewski, the pitching basically became decimated. So it went into the World Series. Yeah. They started their relief ace, who was the most valuable player of the National League that year, named Jim Constanti, in the World Series, and he was beaten by the Yankees, and Vic Raschi 1-0. And they didn't hit it
series
all.
Then evolved into the closest sweep ever. I mean, every single game was a nail biter. Even though the Yankees took it in 4, they really were given a stiff fight by the Phillies. And
the Phillies didn't hit. And what happened was, after that season, they descended into mediocrity for a while, finishing 4th place. The highlight was on the 1952 team. Robin Roberts somehow managed to win 28 games and go 7. And what was telling was that the nucleus of the team, Robert Simmons, Ennis, Ashburn, Jones, and Hamner, was still there as regulars in 1956. And then they went to youth movement in 1957, and they made some trades. They had a star pitcher named Jack Sanford. They shipped to the Giants for Ruben Gomez, a trade that turned out, and they went back down to the tubes. And in 1961, they had a team that won 47 and lost 107 games. And that was entailed a 23-game losing streak, which they had in July and August, which is still the record for the most consecutive losses by any team since 1900. I mean, this team was so bad, and Choo-Choo Coleman, the legendary Met catcher, was so bad that he couldn't stick with this team. And this team is one of the worst teams that's not recognized because of the 1962 Mets. In 1962, with the expansion into Houston and New York, The Phillies rebounded and actually finished one game over 500 in 62, and that team progressed until the disaster of 1964, where they took a 6.5 game lead into the last 2 weeks of the season and wound up losing 10 straight and 10 of their last 12 games and losing the pennant to the St. Louis Cardinals. There are World Series tickets for the 1964 Phillies that are still floating around. And they had several good years after that, and they went downhill again at the end of that decade. In 1972, they made a trade beginning of that season where they shipped pitcher Rick Wise to the Cardinals, even up for Steve Carlton, who in 1972 wound up having one of the most remarkable seasons ever, He won 27 and lost 9 for a team that won 59 games. They won almost half their games, and the attendance reflected it when they were in the vet, which they had moved to from Kaimak Stadium in 1971. The vet would sell out for the Carlton games and be lucky to get 5,000 for any other game. And in 1973, they brought in this rookie third baseman by the name of Michael Schmidt, who turned out to be fairly good. So by 1976, they were back into contention under Danny Ozark, and they won first of their 3 straight National League East titles and lost in the LCS every year, 1976 to the Reds and the next 2 to the Dodgers. Finally, they got over the hump in 1980 when Mike Schmidt had a tremendous year. They had very good pitching, very good Larry Boa. They had Cookie Rojas at second base. They had a pretty good team.
They also picked up Pete Rose.
Yeah, they picked up Pete Rose as a free agent after 1978, and they wound up beating the Kansas City Royals and winning their first World Series ever in 1980.
They were the last of the 16.
Last of the 16 originals to win a World Series. And then in 1983, they won the series again. They won the pennant again. They had, besides Mike Schmidt, they had the 3 old Reds. They had Pete Rose, Tony Perez, and Joe Morgan. And they wound up upsetting the Braves in the LCS. The Braves had won 104 games that season. And then Baltimore beat them 4-1. And after 1983, they tailed off into a bunch of losing seasons, which they really didn't get over with until 2003 when the Ryan Howard and Chase Utley and Jimmy Rollins, when that team came in, and they did very, very well for a number of years, culminating in 2 pennants in 2008 and 2009, and the World Series win in 2008. And, they were very competitive.
Under Charlie Manuel.
Under Charlie Manuel, and by that time they had opened,
manager.
They had opened up the ballpark that they play in now, in Lincoln Financial Field. I think that's the right one. Maybe I might be confusing it with the football stadium.
Yeah, they're hard to remember.
Well, with these names.
They change names every 3 years.
So they play in the beautiful new ballpark. And the team had, gone down into the bottom of the barrel again. And finally, last year, they got rid of a number of players. They didn't re-sign Ryan Howard, who had gone completely backwards in the last couple of years. Utley was on the Dodgers. Rollins had reached the end of the rope. Roy Halladay, who was one of their star pitchers, retired.
They had a formidable pitching staff.
Yeah, Cole Hamels went to the Cubs.
Very brief while.
Yeah, they had Cliff Lee, who was also excellent. Yeah. And, finally, toward the last 2 months of this past season, some of these new young players started to fall into place, and they played pretty well for the last 2 months of the season. They were competitive, so the outlook for this coming season should be fairly bright. They should be improved ball club, and hopefully for the fans down there, the patient Philly fans, that they would deserve something like that. They have four retired numbers. They have retired numbers for Robin Roberts, Richie Ashburn, Steve Carlton, and Mike Schmidt. Number 1 for Ashburn, number 36 for Roberts, 32 for Carlton, and 20 for Schmidt. They should retire.
You haven't retired Chuck Klein's number?
No, they haven't retired Chuck Klein, and they didn't have.
Don't you think that they should?
Possibly, but they're a team that doesn't do this frivolously.
No, they don't. Not nearly as much as.
And they should have something up there to acknowledge Alexander's contribution to those teams, because just the more you look at his numbers for those 7 seasons he was there, the more amazed you become.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
they had kept him and just a few little tinkering here and there. They could have remained a contender into the 20s, and who knows what would have happened if they'd. They
also had one of the better ball players of the dead ball era, another one who some people think deserve Hall of Fame consideration, outfielder Sherry McGree, and they shipped him to the Boston Braves after 1914. So he wasn't on that team that won the pennant. And Gabby Cravath's home runs are looked at.
Cravath used the Baker ball, even though he's a right-handed hitter. Used the short right field porch very effectively.
Yeah, sort of the opposite of Wally Moon when he was at the Dodgers in the 60s. He was a left-handed hitter and figured out how to use the short left field fence in the Los Angeles Coliseum when the Dodgers played there. But they've had a very, very long and colorful history. In fact, before this, I looked up their all-time record in BaseballReference.com. They were also the first team that lost 10,000 games as a franchise. And right now, they're something like 1,500 games under 500 for their history, and it would be a long shot for them to ever break that. But it's a long, colorful history. The Philly fans are extremely devout, and they're extremely patient, going through a whole bunch of periods where the team was not very good, to say the least.
Yeah, that stretch when they finished below 500, except for one season, it's probably the most remarkable stretch in some ways of any team in history, really. That they could have remained for so long, a drag, despite having some very, very, very good players.
Well, the thing is also is that they had the 32 consecutive losing seasons. When the Pirates broke their 20-year losing streak in 2013, that would have just been another, asterisk.
The poster boy, in some ways, for those terrible Phillies teams was a pitcher named Hugh Mulcahy, who, after a couple years with the team, was saddled with a nickname that stuck with him for the rest of his career, losing pitcher Mulcahy. And he really wasted his best years with Philadelphia.
Yeah, he was one of the, along with Hank Greenberg, he was one of the first players that went into the Army in 1941. This was the beginning of the season of 1941, and it's hard to say that, but he might have been better off being in the Army and pitching for some of those Philly teams that he pitched a lot for. Another Hall of Famer that they had for a while, who later went on to great success, was Epirixi, who then went on to the Cincinnati Reds and established Hall of Fame credentials pitching for them.
Yeah, Rixey was on the 15 team that won the pennant. I believe that was his only pennant.
Well, the Reds didn't win anything after 1919.
They had contending teams, but never put it together with him.
So, David, I think this discussed the Phillies very, very well. I think that hopefully people who listen to this will get something out of it. And I hope you enjoy it, the audience enjoys it, as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. Thank you.
I agree, Alan. It was a pleasure.
Okay, same time next week, same bat time, same bat channel. Thank you, everybody.